I pushed the front door open with more effort than usual, still tired from the long checkup, and stopped when I saw the living room stripped of the furniture I left that morning. The couch had been shoved against the far wall, the table moved aside, and a set of unopened exercise equipment boxes sat where my shoes used to rest. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was a dull confusion that settled behind my ribs. Something had been decided without me, and I hadn't even known a decision was on the table. Before I could make sense of it, footsteps came from the hallway. My daughter-in-law appeared first. She didn't wait for me to ask anything. She looked straight at me and said, "Plain as closing a door. Your room is now our gym." The words fell sharp and flat in the quiet house. She didn't soften them or step aside to see how I took it. She said it like it was settled, like it was normal. I stood there with my coat half off, watching her posture. Not angry, not rushed, just firm enough to signal she wasn't expecting a discussion. My son stood behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. He didn't greet me or explain. He didn't even try to look like he was part of the conversation. The silence between them felt practiced, as if they had rehearsed who would speak and who would pretend not to notice the impact. I walked past them slowly, needing to see it with my own eyes. My bedroom door was open, the lights off, and the shadows inside made it look unfamiliar. Boxes lined the walls, plastic tubs, taped cardboard, crates stacked in neat rows, my clothes, my books, my photographs, even the old radio I kept by the bed. Everything had been packed like I was moving out without knowing it. I ran my hand along the top of a box and felt a layer of cold tape sealing it shut. No label, no note, just my life folded and stored as if it no longer belonged to the room it lived in. My phone vibrated in my pocket, breaking the heavy stillness. A missed call from a number I didn't recognize, but the name under it made me blink. It was someone I hadn't heard from in years, someone who wouldn't call for anything casual. I started to dial back, but my daughter-in-law stepped closer, blocking the doorway with an ease that told me she had done it before. She said it was all temporary, that the new setup would benefit everyone, that I just needed to be flexible. Her tone wasn't warm. It wasn't even polite. It was the kind of tone people use when they believe they already own the room they're standing in. I asked her to move aside so I could go in, but she didn't. She crossed her arms and told me the space was being organized, and I'd just get in the way. My son didn't look up. He simply stood there, letting her speak for both of them. I could feel something shifting, not just in the house, but in the way they saw me. Not as a father, not as someone with memories in these walls, more like a person whose presence took up space they wanted for themselves. I walked away without arguing. There was no point in debating a decision that had already been acted out in boxes and rearranged furniture. The hallway felt colder as I made my way toward the guest room. I had never slept in it before. It was where holiday coats were hung, where spare linens were kept, where no one spent more than a minute at a time. The bed was stiff, the air unmoving, the window drafty. I lay down with my shoes still on, staring at the ceiling I didn't recognize. The house was the same structure, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. That night, in a room that had never been mine, the truth settled quietly around me. I had been moved out without ever leaving. When my wife died, the house we built together felt too big for me. Every room carried a memory, and every memory pulled me backward. I tried to keep living in it alone, but the silence grew heavier each month. I stopped cooking real meals, stopped inviting anyone over, stopped opening the curtains some days. My son saw the decline before I admitted it. He told me it wasn't safe to be on my own anymore, that the stairs were steep, that the nights were long. He said moving in with him would help me rest. I believed him because grief makes you slow, and slow makes you easy to guide. The first weeks at their house were gentle enough. My daughter-in-law made schedules, organized medications, and insisted I didn't lift anything heavier than a glass. She spoke like someone managing a task, not welcoming a person. I noticed it quietly at first. She controlled every plate that came to the table, deciding what I should and shouldn't eat based on what she believed a man my age could handle. She adjusted my routines, told me when to shower, when to sit, when to not overdo it. I let her, thinking she meant well. Then she began managing my visitors. A friend from church stopped by one afternoon, and she told him I was sleeping even though I wasn't. A week later, she said the house was too busy for guests. My phone disappeared into a drawer for an entire day once because she said I needed screen rest. Small things, each one easy to dismiss on its own. But together, they tightened around my life like knots I hadn't noticed being tied. My belongings started shifting too. A jacket I wore often vanished from the closet, only to reappear folded in a storage bin. A stack of letters from my wife's sister was moved to the garage without anyone telling me. My books were rearranged, then boxed, then put on a shelf I couldn't reach without asking. When I mentioned the changes, my daughter-in-law said she was keeping things tidy. My son stood beside her, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just silent in a way that felt like permission. His silence became its own message. When she told me to use one mug instead of the whole set to reduce clutter, he said nothing. When she suggested I keep my shoes in the garage instead of the front hall, he nodded once and left it at that. When she corrected me in front of her parents about how many medications I took, though she was wrong, he kept his eyes on his plate. It wasn't open cruelty. It was the kind of steady, passive distance that made each small cut easier for her to make. A neighbor of theirs, an older man who lived 2 houses down, once pulled me aside while I was getting the mail. He said, in a soft voice meant not to be overheard, "Shared households are the hardest on the one who moves in last." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was speaking in general terms, maybe repeating something from his own life. But now, looking back, his eyes had carried a specific warning I failed to see. Sitting in the cold guest room that first night, with my belongings boxed and stacked like they belonged to a stranger, the missed call from earlier kept circling in my mind. The name attached to it brought back a part of my life I'd almost forgotten. I didn't know why someone from that chapter was reaching out now, but the thought of calling back gave me a feeling I hadn't had all day. Not comfort, just the faintest sense of hope. The next morning, my daughter-in-law greeted me with a sweetness that didn't match the tension from the night before. She spoke softly, asking if I slept well, placing a hand on my shoulder as if we'd shared a peaceful evening together. Her smile stayed wide while my son walked into the kitchen behind her, and I realized the sweetness wasn't for me, it was for him. She poured my coffee, stirred it without asking, and set it in front of me like she was performing hospitality for an audience. My son watched the ritual with a faint nod, not noticing the stiffness in my posture or the forced brightness in her tone. After breakfast, they left me alone in the living room, but the quiet didn't settle the way it usually did. Something felt off. I walked toward the hallway and noticed a sheet of paper partially sticking out from a stack of magazines on a side table. When I pulled it free, I saw it was a printed floor plan of the house. Bold letters across the top read, "Home Renovation Concept." Thick marker lines ran through rooms, dividing spaces, reshaping walls. One section was labeled Gym Expansion, and the spot where my bedroom had been was marked with an X. Someone had circled it twice. I folded the page and slipped it behind the stack again. My steps felt heavier as I moved deeper into the hall. The boxes outside my old room were no longer just stacked, they were taped shut. Thick strips of packing tape stretched across their tops, sealed tight. Some had labels written in black marker: donate, dispose, non-essential. I crouched down and touched one of the labels. My handwriting wasn't on any of them. They weren't waiting for me to decide what stayed or left. Those decisions had already been made without me. My son appeared, behind me suddenly, and I straightened up quickly. I asked why the gym was so urgent. He shifted his weight, rubbed the back of his neck, and said something vague about health goals and making progress while we can. His eyes didn't meet mine. He spoke like he was trying to move through the conversation without giving a single concrete answer. Before I could push further, my daughter-in-law called him into the kitchen. Their voices dropped low the moment they stepped around the corner. I stood still in the hallway, listening. Her voice was sharp when she whispered, "We need to make space before the inspector comes." His reply was softer, harder to catch. A shuffle of papers, then her whisper again, "He won't question it. Just stick to the plan." I didn't move until their footsteps went in opposite directions, each pretending nothing had been said. Later, when they stepped out onto the patio, I walked into the kitchen to warm some water. My son's tablet sat on the counter, screen still lit. A message bubble flashed at the top. I shouldn't have looked, but something inside me pushed me toward it before I could talk myself out of it. The most recent text sat in plain view. It read, "He won't resist. He never does." The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the meaning didn't need any explanation. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter without my permission. I tapped the screen off and placed the tablet exactly as I'd found it. Voices drifted in through the patio door, faint and indistinct, but the tone carried a certainty I hadn't heard before. Not nervous, not doubtful. Confident, like people who believed the outcome was already decided. I walked back to the guest room slowly, each step sinking deeper into a truth I didn't want to accept. The gym wasn't an impulse. The boxes weren't temporary. The sweetness wasn't kindness. None of this was sudden. It had all been prepared. I waited until the house settled into its usual late-morning rhythm before pulling out my phone. The missed number from yesterday still sat at the top of the screen. My finger hovered over it for a moment, then I pressed call. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered, cautious at first, then surprised when I said my name. She reminded me she was the social worker I met months ago during a routine clinic visit, the one who helped me fill out a mobility form after my knee injury. I hadn't expected her to remember me, much less call. When I asked why she'd tried reaching me, her tone shifted into something careful. She said my son had contacted her office asking about senior relocation grants. The phrase didn't make sense at first, and she repeated it slowly, making sure I heard every word. Grants for moving older adults into care facilities. Grants that required proof of declining independence. Grants that could be fast-tracked if a family member claimed urgent need. I didn't interrupt her. I listened quietly, letting each detail settle like dust on a floor that hadn't been swept. After the call ended, I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the faint sounds of someone moving in the kitchen. My hands felt steady, but something in my chest tightened with a pressure I hadn't felt before. Not panic, but a focused kind of fear. I walked toward the storage boxes outside my old room, crouched down, and lifted the lid of one that hadn't been taped fully. Inside were sweaters, a half-used notebook, and a folder that should have contained financial statements I kept since my wife passed. The folder was empty. The papers weren't misplaced. They had been removed. I checked another box. More missing items. Receipts, insurance letters, the binder where I kept copies of legal documents, all gone. Someone had opened each one, taken what they needed, and sealed the rest away like clutter they didn't want to deal with. I moved slowly, putting everything back exactly as I found it. There was no rush. Rushing would make noise, and noise would bring questions I wasn't ready to answer. In the study, I opened the desk drawer I once used daily. It was almost empty now, but one sheet lay tucked beneath a stack of outdated manuals. I pulled it out carefully. It was a printed email. The sender was my daughter-in-law. The message was short, direct, and cold in its efficiency. Do you have elder facilities with quick openings, preferably within a week? Need a smooth transition. The timestamp was from last Tuesday. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand, but because understanding it felt like crossing a line I couldn't step back from. I slid the paper into my pocket, lowered the manuals exactly as they had been, and closed the drawer. When I stepped into the hallway, my son was standing near the end of it, watching me. His expression wasn't angry, it was assessing. He asked what I was looking for. I kept my voice even and told him I was just trying to find my calendar. He held my gaze a moment too long before nodding slowly. He didn't believe me, but he also didn't press. That was its own warning. For the rest of the afternoon, I moved through the house with more care than I'd ever needed in my own home. Every step felt like part of a quiet search I couldn't let them notice. They spoke to each other in soft voices when they thought I wasn't listening, but their eyes followed me whenever I passed by. When the sun began to set, I stepped outside onto the back patio and called the social worker again. My voice stayed steady as I asked if we could meet in person. She didn't question it. She said she'd make time. I told her I needed help understanding something I should have seen sooner. The social worker arrived in the early afternoon, stepping into the house with the same calm steadiness she had on the phone. She greeted me quietly and followed me to the dining table, where I had laid out the papers I'd managed to gather. She studied each document without speaking at first, scanning the renovation plans, the printed email, and the empty folders that should have held my financial papers. Her eyebrows lowered slightly as she read, not in surprise, but in recognition. When she finally looked up, her voice was blunt in a way only professionals can manage. She said the couple had submitted forms to her department claiming I could no longer live independently. The wording wasn't vague. It wasn't softened. It was a written statement asserting that I needed placement in a facility for my own safety. She explained this quietly, giving me space to absorb it. The room felt colder as her words settled. She added that requests of that nature are usually accompanied by medical statements or proof of cognitive decline, neither of which existed for me. The forms had been filed anyway. Before I could respond, my phone rang. The realtor's number flashed across the screen. I answered because avoiding calls had already cost me too much. Her tone was careful, the kind used when a conversation might turn into a misunderstanding. She said she needed clarification on one point. The family had asked about selling the unused master bedroom, and she wanted to verify whether that space was truly vacant. My hand tightened around the phone. I told her the bedroom wasn't unused. It was mine. The silence on the other end stretched before she apologized and said she'd update her notes. She ended the call with the kind of caution people use when they realize something is wrong, but don't know how deep the wrongness goes. After the call, I walked the social worker to my old bedroom. She followed me slowly, her steps quiet but attentive. When I opened the door, the boxes were still stacked along the walls, sealed and labeled in ways I hadn't approved. But now, lying on the desk where my things once sat, there was a new sheet of paper, a drafted property redesign plan. I picked it up. The diagram showed the entire floor rearranged, my bedroom removed, the guest room converted to storage, and the area where I currently slept marked as flex space. Nowhere on the plan was there a designated living area for me. The design erased me without acknowledging I'd ever been there. The social worker exhaled slowly as she examined it. She didn't need to explain what it meant. The plan wasn't about a gym. It wasn't about space. It was about removal. When my daughter-in-law returned home, she saw us standing near the boxes. Her expression stiffened before she slipped back into her controlled tone. She said everything we found was for safety modifications, that the gym was part of a health plan for the family, that the redesign was meant to reduce hazards. She spoke quickly, stacking rational explanations like sandbags against a rising tide. None of them addressed the missing documents, the senior relocation forms, or the deceit in her voice. My son walked in a few minutes later. He didn't greet the social worker. He didn't ask why she was there. He looked at the papers on the desk, then at me. His eyes slid away before they could meet mine. He said, almost quietly, "Things changed, Dad," as if that sentence covered everything, as if erasing a person's space was just part of life. I stood there, the redesign plan in my hand, the boxes lining the walls, the social worker watching the truth form piece by piece. For the first time, the picture was complete enough to accept. They weren't trying to move me into another room. They were trying to move me out of their lives entirely. The social worker called early the next morning and asked me to step outside where we could speak privately. Her voice carried a firmness I hadn't heard from her before. She said she had checked her department's internal system after leaving my house and found a request filed by my daughter-in-law for emergency placement at a senior facility. The request stated I was unsafe, disoriented, and incapable of managing daily tasks. None of it was true, but the form didn't need truth to start a process. It only needed a signature. Hearing her list the claims made something inside me settle into a cold, steady dread. When I went back into the house, my phone buzzed with a call from the realtor. She apologized for disturbing me again, but said she needed to confirm scheduling details on the renovation set for the following week. I told her nothing had been scheduled. She hesitated, then explained the couple had already arranged dates and listed them under a removal timeline. She read the exact phrase because she didn't want me to think she was exaggerating it. Removal, not transition, not relocation. Removal. I thanked her, without letting any disbelief slip into my voice. An hour later, I heard my daughter-in-law in the hallway, talking on speakerphone. Her tone was brisk, clipped. She told a contractor she wanted him to start next week, that she needed the walls measured before the gym equipment arrived, and that the current layout wouldn't matter soon. She didn't lower her voice when she walked past the guest room. She didn't look inside either. It was clear she no longer cared if I heard anything. I stepped outside to breathe and saw my neighbor crossing his yard. He waved me over and asked if everything was all right. When I told him things were a bit tense at home, he lowered his voice and said he'd seen city officials taking exterior photos 2 days ago. He thought it was odd because they usually came only when someone requested property changes. The pieces tightened together in my mind with a clarity that didn't come from fear. It came from finally understanding just how far this had gone. Inside, my son met me in the kitchen with a stack of papers in his hand. He spoke calmly, telling me these were temporary relocation forms that needed my signature so the renovations could proceed without delays. He pushed the papers across the counter, acting like it was a routine matter. I didn't touch them. He kept explaining, insisting the house needed improvements and that this was just a short-term adjustment. He grew quieter when he realized I wasn't moving toward the pen. He pressed the papers closer, but he didn't raise his voice. His calmness made the moment heavier than shouting ever could. After he left the room, I walked straight to the coat closet. Inside my old jacket, I tucked my ID, insurance cards, banking papers, and every personal file I had managed to recover. I moved slowly, making sure nothing rustled loudly enough to draw attention. I knew now that documents weren't safe in drawers or boxes. They needed to be where only I could reach them. I folded the jacket carefully and hung it behind two others, hiding it not out of panic, but out of necessity. When the social worker returned later that afternoon, I met her on the porch so no one else would hear. She looked at me for a long moment, as if gauging whether I understood the seriousness of what she'd found. Then she spoke plainly, without softening a single word. "You need legal help. Immediately." The lawyer arrived first, stepping into the house with a steady calm that made the air feel heavier. He greeted me quietly, then spread his papers across the dining table, arranging them with deliberate precision. A few minutes later, the social worker joined us, followed by a city representative carrying a small clipboard and a formal tone that left no room for doubt. They spoke in low voices, confirming that they would meet with my son and daughter-in-law together, and that nothing would move forward without clear answers. Their presence didn't comfort me, but it grounded me. This time, I wasn't facing things alone. I laid out everything I had collected: the printed emails asking about elder facility openings, the redesign plan removing my living space, the relocation forms, the renovation schedule, the emergency placement request. Every piece that had once felt like a separate worry now formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The lawyer placed each item into an evidence folder, labeling them with quiet efficiency. He said it was more than enough to raise serious questions from every agency involved. I nodded, my chest tightening, not from fear, but from the weight of what needed to happen next. As we worked, footsteps approached from the hallway. My daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway, her expression sharp the moment she noticed the papers. She asked why people were in the house without her being informed. Her voice carried a tension she didn't bother to hide. The social worker answered calmly, saying this was a standard visit to clarify discrepancies in recent filings. My daughter-in-law's jaw tightened, and the sweetness she often performed in front of others slipped away. She didn't speak. Further, she simply stared at the evidence on the table, her eyes narrowing as she assessed what had been gathered. My son came home moments later and saw the city representative standing in the hallway. His first reaction wasn't confusion, it was irritation. He stepped quickly toward the front door, positioning himself in a way that suggested he intended to stop anyone else from entering. The lawyer moved beside him, not blocking him, just standing firmly enough to halt his momentum. He informed my son that all officials had the legal right to be present. The message landed hard. My son hesitated, realizing he had no grounds to argue. He stepped back slowly, his shoulders rigid. The realtor arrived shortly after. She walked in with a careful expression, carrying her own folder of documents. When she saw the officials, she asked whether ownership concerns had been resolved. The lawyer explained that no sale, evaluation, or renovation could proceed until the legal standing of the property was verified. The realtor nodded, stating clearly that her company would freeze all activity until she received written confirmation from every relevant authority. My son and daughter-in-law exchanged a glance that carried more panic than they intended to show. The dining table became the center of the room. The evidence folder lay open, each document placed in order, forming a timeline with no gaps to hide behind. My daughter-in-law hovered near the doorway, her posture tense, her eyes flicking between the papers and the officials. My son paced the hallway behind her, muttering under his breath, trying to control the situation without raising his voice. The house felt like a chamber waiting for a verdict, pressure building in the silence between every breath. The lawyer asked me if I wanted anything said privately before the meeting began. I looked at the folder. at the proof of every decision they had made behind closed doors, and at the people who had gathered to help me stand against it. My voice stayed steady when I answered. There was no anger in it, just a cold certainty that had been building over days. Everything gets said in front of them. My son and daughter-in-law walked into the dining room with the kind of calm people wear when they think they can still control a situation. Their faces were composed, but their eyes moved quickly from person to person, measuring the threat. They sat across from me, their postures stiff, their hands folded too neatly. My son asked what this was about. My daughter-in-law added that the house seemed crowded today, trying to sound light, but her voice carried an edge that gave her away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply listed what had been found. The redesign plans removing my room, the senior relocation forms, the emergency placement request, and the renovation schedule set for next week. I spoke slowly, making sure each detail landed. My son shifted in his chair, glancing down at the table. My daughter-in-law smiled tightly, as if I'd misunderstood everything. She said it was all part of helping me transition to a safer setup. She insisted they were trying to support me, that I had misread their intentions, that aging required difficult adjustments. Her words were smooth, practiced. They didn't match the boxes labeled dispose. The lawyer opened the folder and placed the forged documents on the table. He pointed to the signature that didn't match mine, the dates that didn't align, the sections filled out in handwriting that wasn't mine. My son's face tightened. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, saying it was routine paperwork and calling the forgery claim a misunderstanding. The lawyer didn't respond to her explanation. He continued, laying out the illegal requests made under my name, requests that bypassed proper consent procedures. Each document was stamped, time-stamped, and sourced. There was no way to argue they were mistakes. The social worker spoke next. She read directly from the false statements submitted to her department. Claims that I was confused, disoriented, unable to manage my medications, and prone to wandering outside. She didn't change a word. My daughter-in-law's smile faltered. My son stared at the floor. The social worker explained that emergency placement requests, like the one submitted, could have resulted in immediate removal from the home if they hadn't noticed inconsistencies. Her tone stayed professional, but the weight behind her words left no room for excuses. The city official stepped in, flipping open his clipboard. He cited the violations in their renovation filings, missing homeowner signatures, inaccurate floor plan declarations, and an improperly submitted removal timeline. He explained that no renovations could proceed without documented consent from the legal property owner. My son tried to interrupt, saying they were just getting quotes, but the official corrected him without emotion. The filings had not been requests. They had been authorizations. My daughter-in-law turned toward my son, eyes sharp, voice low, the calmness slipping from her expression. She repeated that everything they did was for me, that the house needed upgrades, that I was safer elsewhere. Her tone twisted between control and defensiveness, trying to rewrite the narrative as she spoke. My son didn't back her up. He sat rigid, jaw clenched, trapped between the evidence on the table and the officials watching him closely. I didn't speak again. There was nothing left to clarify. Everything that mattered lay in front of them. Every plan they made, every lie they submitted, every step they took to push me out of a home they never offered to share. The room went quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that settles when truth has nowhere left to hide. Then my daughter-in-law leaned in just enough for only the table to hear her. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You were never supposed to stop this. The police arrived within the hour, moving through the doorway with a quiet authority that shifted the entire atmosphere of the house. They spoke first with the lawyer, then with the city official, gathering a clear understanding of what had unfolded. After that, they sat across from me at the dining table and took my statement with careful precision. They asked direct questions, confirming dates, details, and the sequence of events. Their professionalism made the reality of the situation feel heavier, not lighter. Every word I spoke felt like another step away from the life I thought I still had. They asked to speak with my son and daughter-in-law next. Both tried to keep their composure, but the officers kept the conversation tightly focused. There were no raised voices, no confrontations, just formal questioning that revealed more through what the couple avoided saying than what they admitted. When the officers reviewed the forms submitted in my name, they marked each one for evidence. Watching them handle the papers made it clear how serious the situation had become. After the statements were completed, the lawyer filed the emergency protection order over my house and estate. He filled out the documents at the table where everything had been exposed just an hour earlier. He explained that the order prevented any sale, renovation, or legal action involving the property without my direct approval. He also filed restrictions blocking anyone from making decisions on my behalf. He worked with a calm efficiency that made the entire process feel less like a rescue and more like a restoration of something I hadn't realized was slipping away. Later that afternoon, the contractors called to cancel all renovation plans. Their tone was apologetic, explaining they had been told the paperwork was valid and the owner had consented. They said the project was on indefinite hold and that they would not return to the property without written authorization from me. Hearing that made something in my chest loosen slightly. Not relief, but recognition that one path forward had closed for good. The social worker returned with updated documents of her own. She handed me a copy of the revoked authority statement, formally removing my son and daughter-in-law from all decision-making roles. She explained that they had been flagged for misuse of elder services and that any future inquiries would require full verification directly through me. Her tone stayed professional, but I could see the concern behind her words. She told me plainly that people rarely come this close to losing their autonomy without realizing it. I nodded, not because I had an answer, but because I didn't trust my voice to stay steady. When she left, the house fell into a deep silence, one that felt heavier than anything earlier in the week. I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the empty space where the evidence fold had been. For the first time, I understood how fragile safety becomes when someone else believes they have a right to your life. I had moved in to be closer to family. Instead, I had almost been erased from my own home. The weight of that settled across my shoulders as I walked into the hall, passing the room that used to be mine. The boxes were still stacked inside, my belongings sealed away like the remnants of a person who no longer lived there. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the distance between what I had expected from family and what they had tried to do. Near evening, the police called back with an update. They spoke clearly, without hesitation. They confirmed that charges were being prepared. The first thing I did after the officials left was sit with the lawyer and update every document tied to my name. We rewrote the will, corrected the title records, and added strict protections that required in-person verification for any future changes. He showed me how to secure each file in a way that left no room for quiet interference. Watching him stamp the final page gave me a steadiness I hadn't felt in days. It was the kind of protection I once believed family alone could provide. That evening, I walked through the house slowly, noticing the places where trust had thinned without me seeing it. The corners where they had stacked boxes, the areas marked on those redesigned plans, the hall where my son had avoided my eyes. Everything carried the imprint of a betrayal that hadn't arrived suddenly. It had grown in silence, inch by inch, in the familiar walls I assumed would keep me safe. Betrayal is rarely loud. It creeps in through small decisions people think you're too tired to question. I sat down in the restored room that had once been boxed up like a storage closet. The bed was back where it belonged, the dresser no longer shoved aside, the window clear again. The quiet inside the room felt different now, not empty, just honest. I realized how easily dependence can become a doorway for someone else's plans, how quickly help turns into control when the wrong person holds the pen. It wasn't age that had put me at risk. It was the faith I placed in people who valued convenience over care. As the night settled around me, I thought about others my age who trust too easily, who sign papers without reading them, who assume their families will act with fairness simply because they share blood. I wished someone had looked me in the eye earlier and told me what I had to learn the hard way. So I'll say it now. For anyone who ever finds themselves in the position I was in, document everything. Ask questions even if they make people uncomfortable. Keep copies of your decisions. Lock away anything that protects your future. Autonomy isn't surrendered all at once. It slips away in pieces unless you guard it. When morning came, I made coffee in the kitchen by myself. No one hovered. No one rearranged anything. The house felt like mine again, not because a paper proved it, but because I understood its worth differently. The quiet didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt earned. I had my keys, my documents, and my choices back. I moved through the rooms with the slow assurance of someone reclaiming ground they nearly lost. Later, I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. The sunlight fell across the floor in clean lines, untouched by plans that would have erased the space entirely. Everything was where it should be. Simple, familiar, steady. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't relieved. I was just present, aware of the lesson that had taken shape inside me. Growing old had never been my fear. Losing myself inside someone else's ambition had been. And now that fear had a clear boundary, one I would never allow crossed again. I looked around the room, knowing it remained legally and undeniably mine, knowing the house no longer hid intentions behind closed doors. I'd survived something I never thought I would face in my own family, and I carried the truth of it with me, not as bitterness, but as clarity. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong person is.